To a Dog by George Gordon Lord Byron.
I began the meeting by making this statement, which I think needs to be made to the nation. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
It has now been more than 70 years since America declared war on drugs. Since that time, much has been said and reflected upon regarding the colossal impact the effort to stamp out drug use and the cultural practices surrounding it has had upon the world at large. However, despite the billions of dollars spent and the billions of lives affected by this global crisis, it appears that in the past 10 years, the tides have been shifting in drugs' favor. More and more states have been pushing to decriminalize drug use, and we are now living in an age that can be reasonably called the end of the war on drugs. I would like to re-examine one of the bloodiest battlegrounds of this war, fought in the mountains and the jungles across the Andes and the Amazon. A tale that will take us around the world and across the centuries. One that involves Ronald Reagan, Coca-Cola, crack cocaine, and the election of South America's first indigenous president, Evo Morales. This is the story of one magical plant, the rich cultural practices it inspired, and the ongoing struggle to continue a way of life that has been persecuted for hundreds of years. Welcome to the history of cocaine, crack, Coca, and Quechua. The earliest evidence of the use of coca by humans dates back more than 8,000 years. In the Nanchoc Valley region of Peru, researchers discovered traces of coca leaves, as well as lime, the powdered alkaline agent used to help bind the leaves and make them easier to chew, which could suggest that these ancient Andean peoples may have been cultivating coca plants for recreational or medicinal purposes as early as 6000 BCE. Mummies from the Alto Ramirez culture in Peru dating back more than 3,000 years have been found to contain trace amounts of coca in their systems. In addition, researchers have uncovered a number of ceramic artifacts believed to have been used as spittoons and various tools for preparing the coca. There is significant evidence that ancient Andean peoples had been using coca for the past thousands of years, and this trend continued and reached new heights under the Inca Empire. The Inca Empire was the political organization that ruled over the Andes mountain region for the 15th and much of the 16th century. Incan mummies have been found containing trace amounts of coca. Pottery depicts chewers with characteristic bulged cheeks, and at the royal gardens of the Inca at Cusco, golden renditions of the plant adorned the passageways and parapets of the once revered capital. The Aymara people called the plant coca, or tree in their language, from which the English word coca is derived, and Aymara legend tells of how the lowland peoples of Peru burned down the forests in order to better harvest crops, enveloping God's favorite mountains in smoke. Upon seeing this, the god Kunu became so enraged that he sent torrential rains to punish the people. Cut off from the highlands by the rain, these harrowed Aymara turned to the forests for food, finding among the trees the vibrant green leaves of a mysterious plant. Indigenous peoples across the Amazon jungle and Andes mountain regions of South America revered the plant for its magical powers. They found that chewing this plant gave them renewed strength, more energy, and delayed the effects of hunger. Now, the exact status of coca under the Inca Empire has undergone much scholarly debate pertaining to the subject of whether or not the Incas maintained a state monopoly over the production of coca. While there is some evidence that the use of coca was given a greater ritual significance for warriors and other members of the ruling class, these claims must be understood within the larger context of the general lack of information regarding pre-Columbian Andean society. Regardless of whether it was monopolized or not, historians can be certain through the hundreds of artifacts that coca played an important role in Andean ritual practice, and that its use continued to affect Andean politics even after attempts at Spanish colonization. The first mention of coca by a European came in 1499, when Dominican missionary Tomas Ortiz witnessed the plant being used as a commodity for trade along the Venezuelan coast. Amerigo Vespucci also makes mention of the plant in his journals while passing along Rio Para in Brazil. Initially, Spanish conquistadors and missionaries took on characteristically negative views of the plant. They attempted to curb the use and cultivation of the drug as part of their larger campaigns of indigenous cultural genocide. Part of the reason that colonial masters targeted coca so specifically was its importance in Andean ritual custom. As early as 1522, at the First Council of Lima, Catholic prelates were made aware of the use of coca in ritual ceremonies by indigenous peoples, and were encouraged to prevent natives from making any offerings to the sun or earth with coca, maize, or any other form of indigenous cultural ritual practice. Even though it was initially the position of the Spanish government to prohibit the use and cultivation of coca, it should be noted that there was a small minority of Catholic missionaries who advocated for the rights of indigenous people to chew and use coca as a supplement to their labor. These missionaries often advocated for greater protections for the coca workers, known as camayos, thousands of which died each year as a result of the spread of Colombian diseases and as a result of poor working conditions. In 1569, King of Spain Philip II published a law regarding the colonies in Peru and specifically mentioned coca, stating,
"We are informed that the custom which the Peruvian Indians have in using coca and its cultivation caused them grave troubles, for it is used much for their idolatrous practices, ceremonies, and witchcraft, and they imagine that by carrying it in their mouth they receive strength and vigor for their work, which according to those who have experimented with it, is an illusion of el diablo. And although we have been implored to prohibit coca, we do not wish to deprive the Indians of this mitigation, even if it is in their imagination. Que locura es."
As colonial administration became more deeply entrenched in society, Spanish efforts to prohibit the use of coca gradually lost steam and cooled into reluctant acceptance of the plant's use. Even though Spanish authorities decried the practice as idolatrous witchcraft, they still included coca as part of the rations for Andean laborers. The Spanish government recognized that coca was a necessary supplement to labor in the high altitudes of the Andes, and that it also abetted the effects of starvation and the general lack of nutrition that afflicted much of the Andean population following Spanish conquest. Blas Valera, a Jesuit missionary in the 1600s, recorded that laborers who chewed coca could work all day without eating. Coca also proved useful in the realm of medicine. During the colonial period, doctors, quote, prescribed the application of coca leaf plasters to contusions, the use of coca infusions to treat stomach and intestinal disorders, and a poultice of coca leaves tied to the forehead for headaches. Perhaps the most long-lasting effect that Spanish colonial rule had on coca was the proliferation of coca as a commodity for trade. While it is true that indigenous peoples had been using coca as a commodity for trade long before the arrival of the first conquistadors, under Spanish colonial rule, coca became a cash crop. Spanish chroniclers from the 16th century recorded that, quote, many became extremely wealthy simply from the yields of their coca plantations. Even the church, which had initially been so opposed to coca production and use, saw its economic value and initiated and maintained coca plantations of its own. Indeed, by the end of the 16th century, the debate over coca had largely died down. Even coca's staunchest opponents recognized that the crown couldn't or wouldn't take action against a system that generated so much immense wealth. Still, as the 17th century drew on, there emerged a new and growing problem in coca's consumption: the rapid and precipitous decline of the indigenous populations of the Andes. The spread of Colombian diseases, for which Native American peoples had no natural inoculation, combined with the effects of the genocidal actions carried out by the Spanish colonial government, led to the tragic deaths of millions of Native Americans. In the Andes, this massive depopulation affected coca in a number of important ways. First and foremost, it meant that there were less people chewing and growing coca. Secondly, much like the Black Death in Europe, as population declined and demand for labor increased, owners and employers were forced to offer better working conditions and greater standards of living to the working classes, meaning that fewer people had to rely upon coca as a nutritive substitute. Finally, wine and alcohol offered a less persecuted alternative for recreational use that coca had once dominated. All of this meant that by the 18th century and the beginning of the end of colonial rule in Latin America, coca was a highly local practice that maintained relative cultural significance among indigenous populations, however, was otherwise obscure. Unfortunately, it is here that I must conclude part 1 of our journey into the history of coca. But Before I go, I'd like to leave you all with one last myth. I've already shared the Aymara story of Coca's origin. However, I would like to offer its counterpart, the Quechua legend of Coca's origin. According to indigenous Quechua folklore, before Coca became the tree as it is now, it was a very beautiful woman. But because she was evil in her body, they killed her and cut her in half and buried her. And from her was born a tree, which they called Macoca and Coca Mama. And since then, they began to eat it. And it was said that they carried it in a bag that they could not open to eat except after having copulated with a woman, in memory of that other, and that there had been and are many harvests, and for this reason they called it Coca. You've now reached the end of the video. Thank you to anybody who's actually watched this far. This video took a lot longer to make than I expected, but it's something I'm really, really passionate about and really, really proud of. And I want more people to know about the struggles of one small plant and its great impact on history. I'm a history student and I watch a lot of history YouTube videos, and I thought I might as well give a crack at it. So please, if anybody is watching this, share it, maybe post it on History Reddit. Say I got something wrong, so that way all the history nerds go and comment what I got wrong so I can correct it in part 2. That would be awesome. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful night. Like, subscribe, and follow for part 2.